It used to be that public figures ranging from Calvin Coolidge, Franklin Roosevelt were agreed on the proposition that public employees had no right to strike. FDR's words were, quote, "A strike of public employees manifests nothing less than an intention on their part to obstruct the operations of government until their demands are satisfied. Such action, looking toward the paralysis of government by those who have sworn to support it, is unthinkable and intolerable." In fact, it proved to be both thinkable and, judging from recent experience, tolerable. Perhaps the most conspicuous booster of public employee strikes is Mr. Jerry Worf, who is the head of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, hereinafter referred to as the Employees Union, the Public Employees Union. This union is, by the way, the fastest growing union in the country, having risen from 250,000 members to not far from 1 million in the last 10 years. Since 20% of the working force in America works for the government, Mr. Worf, if he succeeds in moving in on federal employees and consolidates his advantages in the states, could become the biggest union leader of them all, a factor not unappreciated by George Meany, with whom Mr. Worf has had his differences. Mr. Worf was born in New York City, went to school there, and took a degree from New York University in 1940. He went directly into union organization, rising to his present eminence. On the side, he has engaged in a number of disreputable activities, including membership in the executive board of the Americans for Democratic Action. Only 7 states have legislation permitting strikes by public employees, provided, and I use the language typical of the various laws, quotes, "they do not endanger the health and welfare of the general public." Notwithstanding, Mr. Worf regularly backs strikes by public employees, for instance, recently by the police in Baltimore. I should like to begin by asking him, do you take a general or only a limited position in favor of civil disobedience?
I haven't the faintest notion of what you mean, a general or limited. That's asking me how many angels there are on the top of a pin, or do I believe in beating my wife? Let me say that to be forthright in responding to that question, that I felt during the period of the civil rights changes in America, when at the time that Mr. Roosevelt made those comments about public employee strikes, it was illegal for a black man to be served a meal in many states in the United States. And I felt that the civil disobedience that was attendant to giving blacks parity with white people with regard to access to our political and social system was legitimate and appropriate civil disobedience and in keeping with the American spirit.
So therefore, you
so that if you pass a repressive law which denies men equity, which makes it possible for unreasonable people to exploit them, and you exhaust all of the remedies of reasonableness at such a time, there perhaps comes a point when you want to strike, because you have no other mechanism available to you.
Well, in a democratic society, what do you consider exhausting reasonable remedies?
Well, for example, if you pass a law, as they have in many states, saying that you have no right to strike, I have said over and over again, unlike some of my colleagues in this work, that you have to have alternative machinery. For example, you made reference to the Baltimore strike. I pleaded for the right to recommend to our membership and to recommend to the city of Baltimore and to the governor of the state of Maryland arbitration of the grievances of the blue-collar workers, the sanitation workers, and the policemen. And the governor and the mayor who were in control of the situation rejected arbitration, and thereby inflaming the men into a wildcat strike, men and women. There were very few women, but there were a few. So that in essence what I'm saying is, no, we don't want to strike, Mr. Buckley, perhaps by your standards we're not conservatives, but public employees are conservative. They're not they don't want to strike for the privilege of going without wages or walking around the city hall. They strike because there's nothing else available to them in the course of solving their difficulties.
Well, there are, of course, two broadly described approaches to the question, and I'm extremely anxious to discuss them both with you. One is the economic question, one is the theoretical question. We started off with the theoretical question, I think with some purpose. If we agree that in a, quote, free society, a free society is one loosely defined here, like our own, do you take the position that any remedy is available if the unit, the aggrieved unit involved, feels that he is not getting satisfaction through the specified remedies? And I take it your answer is yes.
I take the position, and I don't like to be yes or no on a theoretical question like that, that a strike is to be avoided at all costs.
No, not at all costs, at most costs.
At most costs.
Okay, that's different.
I think you're right. And I think your correction is accurate. I would say to you that in many instances, there's a whole series of public employee strikes earlier this year. Most of them were sort of rank and file revolts, and sort of the union leadership ran to get out in front of the situation. That's kind of a tragedy because union leadership were aware of the high price these people would pay for engaging in an illegal strike. But I do say this, in the kind of society we live in, legislating prohibitions against strikes without legislating reasonable machinery, I underline the word reasonable because sometimes they do legislate some phony machinery, without legislating reasonable alternatives, what we call impasse procedures in the technology of labor management is unreasonable. For example, in testifying before the Labor Committee of the Senate last week, I sort of surprised Senator Taft by agreeing with him with the fact that I thought a voluntary arbitration would be an excellent solution to many of these problems, by agreeing that police officers, firefighters, other emergency employees should not have the right to strike, but that they would strike if you didn't have what I call alternative mechanisms. I also pointed out that the League of Municipalities, Conference of Mayors, all of these other league, county employers, all of these management groupings were all passing wild resolutions saying that they'd rather take strikes than take arbitration. That in our efforts to legislate impasse procedures, which would eliminate the need to strike if workers have grievances, that our major adversary is the employer, the boss, the organized city manager, the organized mayor, the organized, although they might on Monday send a representative to the Congress to oppose an arbitration mechanism, on Tuesday they ask a local labor council to support their re-election. They're sort of flexible human beings, and we sort of live in this nether world.
Yeah, you've touched on a lot of extremely interesting points, and all of them radiate in to one of the central problems. For instance, more often than not, you find yourself as a union contending against an employer in whose interest it is to satisfy your demands in virtue of the fact that he desires your political support. You are, in that sense, a public lobbyist. On the other hand, this is the same employer who, in order to satisfy your demands in a particular situation, has to raise, let us say, taxes in general, which is itself unpopular. But since that which is involved in raising taxes is less palpable than that which is involved in favoring the beneficiaries of those taxes, by and large, the democratic habit has been to take from the many for the purpose of giving to the few. Now, reducing this to a theoretical level, when you say that you would welcome compulsory arbitration.
I didn't say compulsory, I said voluntary.
Voluntary arbitration. Do I understand you to define that as a situation in which the employer unit and the employee unit agree that in case of impasse, a tribunal satisfactory to both parties will decide as between the demands, and both will bind themselves
to accept
the verdict?
Finding.
You do.
Yeah. Now, there was a time when I opposed this very strongly, on the theory that you'd come down the middle on the thing, and that the arbitrators were unwilling to plow fresh ground in dealing with needs as needs change, and so on. But I've come to understand that not only is the union fearful of what the arbitration panel might do, but the employer is equally fearful. Now, if we're both fearful of what an impartial panel will do, then that will accelerate the bargaining process to such a degree that we can mutually agree before we get to the point of the impasse. That goes to the arbitrator. Let me make one comment.
Limited demands. And
limited demands. But let me make one comment on the business of satisfying the few at the expense of the many. It's only fair to say, Mr. Buckley, that if you check the statistics, you would find that public employees in this country lag far behind, with a few exceptions. There are some extraordinary exceptions that get a lot of press. But the rank and file of public employees, local and state government employees, who are the people I represent. I have no desire to represent the federal employees, who are for the most part organized by another union with whom we have an excellent relationship. Local and state employees lag far behind their counterparts in private industry in doing the same work.
Who in turn lag far behind the federal employees?
Who in turn lag behind the federal employees. And the reasons for that are very complex. The premise of job security during the Depression era, for which workers were willing to pay a high price, the fact that we're not covered by the National Labor Relations Act and don't have access to the mechanisms that workers in the private sector have, the meanness of politicians who like to go around promising public services and tax cuts at the same time, and they are responsive to their electorate, particularly on a local and state level. The ineptness of public management at a local and state level, it's not particularly good at the federal level, but it's very bad. We've been victimized by all of these things. Workers in general sort of this year lag 5% behind in real earnings. I think a neutral statistician, a neutral economist would assure you that we're about 2 or 3 points behind this 8% lag in real earnings in the past year. Well, and so that in essence, we have not benefited from the ability to bring pressure or the ability to develop political clout. On the contrary, I think so many of our people have exaggerated their political input and not try to deal with the question in terms of merit, in terms of the usual dynamics of labor management relations.
We're trying to discover here two things. One, what are the theoretical parameters within which, in a free but orderly society, people can move when they are charged with delivering vital services? And the second is, what are the mechanics by which injustice is discovered? Now, in New York City, which I'm primarily acquainted with, the municipal employees have tended in the last 10 years to receive their raises through a series of perks, primarily an extraordinary extension under Mayor Lindsay of the right to retire.
Incidentally,
20 years after.
That was never implemented by the legislature, that right to retire.
Well, it was New York City.
No, sir. They negotiated, if I may. I too am a native in New York, and our largest affiliate is in New York, and I was the first director of what is now the big public employee union in New York. There are several, but ours is the biggest.
Yeah.
What Mayor Lindsay negotiated with us, where we gave up wages and other working conditions in exchange for a good retirement system, needed legislative approval. Mr. Rockefeller didn't approve of our union's hostility to him and thereby persuaded the legislature not to do what they hadn't done in perhaps 100 years, allow the home rule decision of the city to prevail, so that this pension you're talking about never was forthcoming.
Well, but it was certainly forthcoming for the transit employees, for instance.
I don't know if they ever got, I don't think they got theirs either. But they may have gotten theirs, but we didn't get
did.
ours. We didn't get ours, most other city employees.
You being in this case who? I was talking about
135,000 municipal employees who are not policemen, firemen. No, they're not policemen, they're not firemen, they're not teachers.
And transit workers.
And they're not transit workers, everything else.
Well, okay, let's just say
no, with some exceptions, okay. But fundamentally that is.
Let's say that I'm confining myself to teachers, firemen,
I don't think the teachers
employees,
got there. The teachers didn't get their...
well, I took that from you. In any case.
What we have to do is be accurate, Mr. Buckley. And,
yeah, and I'm attempting to be...
I like broad brushes sometimes myself, but we did not get these perks that you talk about in New York in terms of a retirement system. We're awaiting action by the legislature. I hope that the political situation is such next year that the legislature will carry out the commitment that the city of New York entered into with the employees.
You have a sort of a Napoleonic mannerism when you say we. I never quite know who we is.
Members of the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees.
Yeah, that's right, and that of course changes from city to city.
Napoleonic is a bit unfair. It's a bit unfair, particularly from you.
Put a sort of grand. No, I speak only for myself. In New York City, it is true, and it has been widely discussed, and there have been thousands of editorials and letters on the subject, that one of the ways of satisfying people is not through raising wages, but through perks. Now, the last figures that I saw from the labor from the Labor Statistics Bureau is that approximately 31% of the wages in America are in the form of perks of one sort or another. They have to do with retirement, they have to do with pensions, they have to do with hospitalization, and so on and so forth. As I understand it, to the extent that that sector broadens, the other almost necessarily narrows in a competitive situation. And what you do is to constipate the flow in and out of a particular job on the basis of which you get the most meaningful indices. For instance, if the people, say, who are operating this television studio this afternoon found that their wages were unsatisfactory, the natural thing would be for them to go somewhere that they would pay, that would pay them more, right? But if built in to their investment in their job here were a series of perks that only paid off after, say, 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, then there is a tendency to keep them here, but also to keep them here unhappily.
Again, now, your statistical premise is unsound. With regard to blue-collar workers, because of the bad wages, turnover in public employment has been very high. I would suggest to you that the cameramen in this studio have better what you call perks, in other words, fringe conditions, than do most public employees in the United States.
How does that alter my argument?
Well, you're saying that there's a tendency to sort of hold on.
Yeah.
What the tendency has not worked, and I would add the most important fact of all, the most important fact of all, is that our so-called perks in the public sector 30 years ago were better than the perks that exist in the private sector. But in the last 10 years, I would suggest to you that the health care, retirement systems, et cetera, are in essence as good in the public sector or as bad, depending upon the part of the country you come from, but that wages in the public sector lag behind those in the private sector. An electrician in this building makes about twice as much, perhaps 3 times as much, as an electrician who is employed by the state of Virginia.
Well, I'm not here making an argument in favor of private sector wages or against private sector wages. What I'm saying is that in a free society, that which is ideal is that which is responsive, and that the best way to handle a situation in which people aren't being paid what the market, the value that the market attaches to their services, is to pave the way for their moving from one position to another. Now, to the extent that you pour in a lot of concrete through perks and fringe benefits, you make precisely that mobility more difficult. And then you run into a situation where you need arbitration panels and people invoking heavenly justice and so on to decide whether, for instance, you're better off earning $14,000 as a policeman in New York City or $9,000 as a policeman in Baltimore. In olden days, that situation would be decided over a period of a generation by the number of Baltimore policemen who moved to New York and vice versa. And a thing called arbitrage would take place, and you would get rough social justice. But this, with this,
social justice.
I know, very rough social justice, but there really isn't any other kind.
Yes, there is.
No, sir.
There has to be. Mr. Buckley, we're dealing with a philosophical situation. I think, and perhaps we're in disagreement, and I respect your concern, but I think that one of the real criteria by which you judge the freedom of a society is by the strength or weakness of its labor movement.
Why?
For a very simple reason, that the litmus test, whether it is the extreme left of the extreme left of communism or the extreme right of fascism taking over, the very first thing that's eliminated in those kinds of societies is a free labor movement. A free and rational labor movement, Mr. Buckley, is the best guarantee that we have ever found. It's not a perfect guarantor. It's not without faults, flaws, shortcomings, but it's the best guarantee we have that you preserve the right of workers to have an input into the society, that an elite, or those who have money and power, don't control the society totally. And it's only through a trade union movement that the little man has some input into the society, so that if we have your rough kind of justice and eliminate such mechanisms as trade unions or limit the input of trade unions unreasonably, there should be reasonable limits on any institution in our society, then I must say fundamentally you're tampering with the very premise of what we loosely call a free society. I think this is badly understood in the United States. Among the most important reasons it's badly misunderstood is I'm not sure that the American labor movement's leadership, and I think George Meany understands that mission, but I think many other leaders do not understand that mission.
Well, you're getting into awfully generic formulations, and I don't mind to the extent that you are.
Well, you raised a generic situation about rough justice, and
sure,
I thought I was getting less generic than you.
But I would say that
in the quite sure I know what the word generic means. I'm a simple worker, Mr. Buckley, and I would say I've heard it applied to prescriptions in the past, never to social systems.
Well, the opposite of particular. I would say that frankly, in the ideal society, there would be no opportunity for business to exploit through collusive practices a worker, and under the circumstances, no need for the worker to unionize except to the extent that he chose to do so for primarily social reasons.
That's not possible in a free society. A free society is an uncomfortable
society. In the first place, there's a very free society in Switzerland, which unions play a very little role. We have a pretty free society.
We have a very free society in Sweden, in which unions play a very big role.
You started off a moment ago with a loose correlation, in which you talked about a correlation between the strength of unions and the strength of freedom.
Yeah, but you talk about
I believe that unions are very strong in England.
If it's a typical society, it's an atypical society, and Sweden is an atypical society. And the point is, premises must be general.
I said that Switzerland was an example of a free society with weak labor unions.
And I counted with Sweden, and let's put that one behind us.
Well, I can see that it suits your polemical convenience to do so.
Well, I think you're building a cathedral. I think you're building a cathedral, in Switzerland, which may need a cathedral.
It's also true that the relative rise in labor union strength in America has sharply diminished in the last 30 years. And I do not think it follows from that that the relative freedom of the American worker has diminished. There are actually states that give the worker the right not to join a union if he chooses not to do so. And these are states against which you and your ideological bedmates agitate very, very heatedly. You believe in a free worker, but you don't believe in a worker so free as to reject your patronage. But getting to the specific question...
Rhetoric, and but okay, go ahead. Let's get to something that I can deal with instead of
let's deal with
glib terms. I'm not...
Maybe let's not depart from Baltimore from now until we turn to the panel. How's that?
Well, why shouldn't we depart from anything? You've gone all the way to Switzerland, back to a free society, from philosophy to the concrete.
You were talking a moment about free and rational labor unions.
Reasonableness that you accord yourself, but go ahead. You're boss. Go ahead.
No, I'm not. No, not boss.
I'm used to unreasonableness on the part of those who have power.
Well, after all, you also exercise the right to walk out.
No, I could do that, but I find no need to do that yet. If
it gets any worse.
No, it was. As a matter of fact, I don't think it's been bad at all. I think you've been eminently reasonable, a bit manipulative.
Up until we got to Baltimore?
And I could... No, I'd like to talk about Baltimore. But what I don't like is you turning it on and off at your convenience. That's all.
No,
Go ahead, sir.
You mentioned the word free and rational unions. Now, I would suggest that certain things in a humane society have got to be excluded. For instance, in my judgment, you've got to exclude a strike by ambulance drivers. I simply take the flat position that nobody who drives an ambulance on whom the life of your wife or child might very easily depend ever has a right to strike. And I consider that a policeman is in that category, and you do not.
I do. I agree that an ambulance, I had an allergic reaction to some penicillin some months ago. My life was probably saved by an ambulance and prompt attention in an emergency room, having taken a tablet of penicillin for the first time in many years, and boom. And I feel very strongly about it, personally. But speaking in a broader and in an institutional sense, certainly an ambulance driver can be denied the right to strike. Certainly a policeman can be denied the strike. I only had one small caveat, and I haven't heard you respond to it. Give me an alternative machinery whereby the grievances of that ambulance driver and that policeman can be solved. For example, voluntary arbitration of his grievance. Now, is that a fair position?
You've got an impossible philosophical quandary.
I happen to think, I don't think it's impossible. I think it's very reasonable.
You started by saying, I agree with you, he has no right to strike, but give me an alternative. I say, I'm not obliged to give you an alternative. If he has no right to strike, he has no right to strike.
I said, give me a caveat.
All right, no, what you're saying is...
I have a caveat.
What you're saying is, how are we going to settle his problems? I'm willing to discuss that, and I'm willing to be instructed by you on that subject. But don't tell me, A, that you agree with the postulation that you don't have a right to strike, and that it therefore is my philosophical responsibility to give you an alternative.
And wasting time. No. I am saying you have no right to deprive...
Most arguments are settled by philosophical definition.
All right. The philosophical definition that I have, without playing games with it, is a very simple one. I think our society has certain kinds of people who should be denied the right to strike if you fear that their services are critical to the well-being of any single individual or group of individuals. I would point out to you that we once experimented with a law outlawing strikes of utilities. We found after a while that it was better to eliminate that law. The employers wanted to eliminate it, the workers, because it was sort of a challenge to the workers to engage in strikes of utilities, which are very important institutions. But let me say this. I agree that strikes are to be avoided. I agree that strikes should be avoided for all workers, certainly for the people that I represent.
You're now diluting it.
I'm not diluting it.
What
can I tell you something, sir?
You backed the Baltimore strike.
I backed the Baltimore strike after...
So that it meant that people did not have recourse to those policemen who followed your strike.
I backed the strike of policemen in Baltimore after the mayor publicly in the Baltimore Sun said, I reject the opportunity to arbitrate the grievances of the Baltimore policemen.
Therefore, you just reversed yourself. Because a moment ago you were saying that...
I understand you, Mr.
A moment
Buckley.
ago...
Maybe I'm... Now,
A
what we
moment
should
ago
have
you were
said
saying
to
that
those
ambulance
Baltimore
drivers...
policemen is, resign, that's better than strike. But they didn't strike, you know, they demonstrated. They demonstrated, and their police chief took the most draconian actions against them for demonstrating their grievances. They took some small action that involved 10 men, and he promptly set about threatening them with discharge, which brought the other workers out in a strike that they never wanted. We offered to arbitrate before and during, and ultimately they settled at a bargaining table, but the governor and the mayor totally rejected arbitrating the grievances. Now you tell me that I'm contradicting myself. Well,
yes,
that's the operation of your mind, and the operation of my mind is that I'm being very reasonable.
No. The definition of contradiction was, I think, Aristotle's, which is that you can't believe in one thing and its opposite simultaneously. Now, if you will just refine your statement.
I haven't had an argument like this since I was in a college dormitory 30 years ago. We're dealing with the reality of providing police protection to the people of Baltimore. And I'm saying to you that the governor and the mayor deliberately provoked the strike, and that these workers are conservative. Mr. Buckley, they're even conservative by your standards. They didn't want to strike.
They're my friends.
They were forced. They had no choice. They were either slaves or free Americans. They chose to be free Americans. Don't you understand that?
Wait a minute. I believe in laws against involuntary servitude. We have that written into our Constitution.
Well, good.
And if
we can agree on that, then the Baltimore policemen were justified in doing what they did.
But now, wait a minute.
They were forced into involuntary servitude.
But I hope you agree that we have courts in the land that are sophisticated enough to distinguish between a guy who leaves his job.
That's the most utopian statement I've ever heard.
Wait a minute. And a guy who says, let us all leave our jobs, and let us all leave our jobs at midnight, so that when they call St. Cecilia's Hospital for an ambulance driver, there won't be one there.
But that's not what
That's not taking advantage of involuntary servitude. I'm giving you an example. This is not taking advantage of involuntary servitude. This is striking. And the distinction between those two, you have focused on since NYU days.
That hasn't happened.
It did happen in Baltimore.
It did not happen in Baltimore.
That you were quoted as saying, quote, under the circumstances, it was the only course of action available, meaning a strike of public employees who would pledge not to strike, meaning that 600 policemen were not available to help people in emergency situations. And you were justifying this, even after having said that you agreed with me that just as in the case of the ambulance driver, there was no right of a policeman to strike.
Could I say one word on this? And first of all, I don't want policemen to strike for pragmatic reasons, for philosophical reasons, and I want you to know policemen don't want to strike. Those very same policemen had arrested me a day earlier on a picket line with sanitation workers, or 2 days earlier, doing their duty. I want you to understand, sir, that the situation is that an employer has a law that says if you strike, the individuals and the union will be fined $25,000, $50,000, $100,000 a day. And the judge who heard the case, unlike your utopian statement, said, I'm not interested in whether this was right or wrong or justified, or it was violation of our law, period. And he even said, my father is a policeman, I empathize with the policeman. He even gave us some sympathy, but he fined us $25,000 or $50,000 a day, I don't remember. And he fined the leadership, the president of the union or the business agent of the union and so on. Now, the policeman in Baltimore said, please, boss, we don't want to strike. Boss, we're going to have a little demonstration so we can call...
Whom were they addressing when they said boss?
Well, it's
a...
I think that's a cheap shot. They were addressing their employer. They were addressing the mayor of Baltimore, who fixes their wages, and the governor of Baltimore, who appoints their police commissioner. They sort of have a bifocal situation there. Now, then they pleaded for several days, weeks, months. Then they got down to the bottom line where they held a meeting where there was no paid union representatives from our union in the room, and made a decision to have a demonstration. They had their little demonstration, and this police commissioner there decided he was a sort of Junior League Calvin Coolidge. He came down on them like gangbusters, and he assailed the thing that you talk about the most. He assailed their dignity as Americans. The one thing nobody's ever been able to reproach is the real patriotism that exists among policemen in particular and trade unionists in general. He reduced them into nothing. He said, I am the power, I can destroy you. Get back to work. I don't give a damn what your grievances are.
Who was this guy?
This man named Parmelo, who's the police commissioner, who said, I don't care what the mayor wants or what the governor wants. We sort of got caught between, there's no law in Maryland because the governor had vetoed a law that would bring reasonableness into negotiations. So the employees had no choice. A strike was called. During the strike, they begged and pleaded for the right to function and work as volunteers to protect the city. I offered.
But they did
the mayor, please let me finish, sir. I offered the mayor to go to the union, call a meeting of the union and plead with them to take arbitration and to ask the employer. But before I could even talk to our membership about arbitration, the mayor of that city saying, I will not arbitrate. We will not, under no circumstances. Well, by God, that adds another incentive, another provocation, if you please, to bring about the strike and strengthen the strike. And ultimately, we reached a settlement of the strike. And the settlement terms were not carried out. Part of the settlement terms would be there would be no reprisals against the strikers, and you know that men have been fired and discharged, and the union has been torn up, and its right to collect dues taken away, its voluntary right to collect dues from people who desire to pay it if they so see fit, or if they don't desire to pay it. They've been fined a tremendous sum of money and so on. Now, this is a classic example of an employer who knew that he had all the power to punish, refusing to deal with the equities of the employees. And the men responded in the way they did. Could I assure you, without anything else being understood on this program, that in spite of this introduction that I'm the firebrand that leads all these strikes, I'm as conservative as you are. I don't like strikes, maybe for altogether different reasons. I don't want strikes. Our membership doesn't want strikes. We go out on strike out of sheer desperation. The kind of man or woman who takes a public job essentially wants security and stability in their economic life. They're not strikers. They're not people who raise hell. They're the easy, moderate, comfortable people who are more likely to vote conservatively than liberally. Now, basically speaking, what we are up against is intransigent politicians who say, the law is on our side, take it or leave it. And some of the big liberals in the United States, Mr. Buckley, some real true bluers who will drive you up the wall, they think it's good politics to fight the well-being of our membership nowadays. And as a matter of fact, we occasionally find more reasonableness with a conservative or a moderate. As 10 years ago, all these liberals were saying, you know, forward, on and on. The whole business of taxes and the concern of the moderate and the middle class and the upper middle class with the, you know, absolutely strange, obscene, unreasonable tax system we have in this country has led to a whole new set of political relationships between public workers and their bosses. Mr. Buckley, you got us all wrong.
Well, the fact of the matter is that you have adjusted with, I think, quite adroitly, a patriotic rhetoric for the purpose of permitting you to decide when it is that you will proceed without any reference to local laws. There have been 30 illegal strikes backed by you this year. Your man in Ohio said, quotes, I'm going to shut down the state of Ohio. Mr. King said that. And you said...
Mr. King is not my man.
Well,
he's not on our payroll. I have nothing to do with him. I never heard of him before today. I don't have a man named King in Ohio.
He's in charge of your union.
No, he is not, sir.
Well, he's been fired?
No, he never was. It might be some guy who went to the papers and said, on behalf of the union, I do this. As a matter of fact, we don't even represent a large majority of state employees in Ohio.
It is.
That strike, in a large part, was a spontaneous strike of people who were not members of any union. Lots of them joined our union afterwards. And Mr. King is not a representative of my union. I know where you got that quote from. I never heard of him.
Well, let's in this age of candor, Mr. Worth, before turning to the panel, agree that, in fact, there isn't anybody in this room who is unfamiliar with a public employee strike. anybody in New York, for instance.
I have led strike. I led the strike in Memphis, and I'm very proud of it. I led a strike in Atlanta, and I'm very pleased with the role I played for. It was justified. It was necessary. We wouldn't have achieved a measure of justice without it. Of course I've been involved in strikes. Of course our union has supported strikes. We always support our membership.
Okay, so the fact of
the membership is the boss in our union,
right. So the fact of the matter
Mr.
is
Buckley.
that you do believe in taking the law into your own hands. You do believe in public employee strikes.
In the same way that Martin Luther King took the law into his own hands to get equity for black people. In the same way that Mahatma Gandhi, Gandhi took the law in his own hands to get reasonableness. We don't believe in violence. We don't believe in confrontation. But when we have no choice, we withhold our services.
It is the argument not only of Mahatma Gandhi, but also of Hitler and Lenin and Stalin. And the answer is...
Can I say to you, sir,
well,
I think that kind...
Anybody who laughs simply hasn't read the works of Hitler, Lenin, and Stalin.
You're absolutely right, but Mr. Buckley, Mr. Buckley, isn't that the kind of demagogy that once led a well-known author to call you a crypto Nazi on a TV show? Isn't that the same kind of unreasonableness you're giving me today?
I'm not calling you a Nazi. I'm simply saying that...
But aren't you sort of comparing me in the implication? But I heard you called a Nazi. I didn't believe it. I would hope you would do the same. Deal with me in the same reasonable way and not in demagogic terms.
What I'm saying is that people who decide to take the law into their own hands...
So you equate Martin Luther King and you equate Gandhi with Stalin and Hitler. Well, that's absurd.
So therefore, the question that you need to decide is, are they taking the law into their own hands for purposes we approve of or we disapprove of? We happen to approve the purposes of Mahatma Gandhi. We happen to disapprove of the purposes of Hitler. But somewhere along the line, it becomes less obvious than the difference between Mahatma Gandhi and Hitler. You get the question of the firemen in New York City who strike and don't come while a house burns down. At that point, you become extremely evasive. Because
I don't become evasive. I've been accused of everything, but I must admit, at this late station in life, this is the first time I've ever been called evasive. But I think, sir, what you do is establish a premise, build a cathedral on that premise, and woe unto him that would question the fact that your architecture isn't perfect. But I assure you that the premise is unsound, and the cathedral never got off the ground, and you know, Switzerland is a place in which I think...
Switzerland really bugs you, doesn't it?
Yeah, I kind of think that you really reached hard to find that one. As a matter of fact, public employee unions are very strong in that country, and they managed to get along without strikes because there's reasonableness on the side of the employer. And I was very pleased with their vote yesterday when they decided to let immigration continue. I read the papers this morning, too, Mr.
Well, then
Buckley.
why are you in favor of the labor unions that don't want the braceros to come in from Mexico?
Why am I for a very simple reason?
The organized labor union movement in America would have voted exactly the opposite way in Switzerland.
Exactly. For the very simple reason that the braceros are used to deprive Americans of jobs and of decent wages, whereas in Switzerland they don't deprive anybody of anything. But on the contrary, assist the economy, and there is a need for these people, and not used to break strikes of $5 and $10 a day farm workers.
35% of the Swiss
you know that analogy is unreasonable.
No, on the contrary.
But to compare the braceros to the Italians in Switzerland is so unreasonable and shows a kind of manipulation of the facts that doesn't do you justice.
There was never a point at which 1/6 of the labor force of America was slipping in over the Rio Grande. But 1/6 of the labor force of Switzerland is precisely...
It's not slipping in, it's coming in legally.
I know, and they want, and the reason they don't come in legally here is because we don't let them.
Because we don't have jobs. We have 6.5 million people unemployed in this country, and they have 100 people unemployed in Switzerland, which you forgot to mention. We have 6.5 million people unemployed. So that the desire to close the line in Mexico is one thing with 100 people unemployed, but 6.5 million people unemployed is unreasonable. And you know what, Mr. Buckley? I think you know that fact.
Yes,
and I think this kind of manipulation of facts...
I know that fact, and I also know that in Switzerland there's no...
Because the same story in the New York Times carried...
There is no minimum wage rate. Maybe that's why there's less unemployed. Children and people can work as apprentices. They don't have to join labor unions, and get fancy salaries as quickly as while they're learning.
That's true, but there's something.
That may be why they're.
But can I tell you something else that you forgot to mention? That in Switzerland, health care is guaranteed. In Switzerland, retirement is guaranteed. In Switzerland, you don't need organized charity to take care of the elderly and the poor and the sick. In Switzerland, you have a well-developed social system. In the United States, we have an underdeveloped social system.
And in Switzerland, they gave the vote to women last year. Yeah. Mr. Robert Kuttner of the Washington Post.
Bill, I want to know what you would propose as a way of avoiding...
The Brosen Plan.
The what?
The Brosen Plan.
Tell.
He's a professor at the University of Chicago, and he says that it is impossible, with reference to any abstract data, to decide what a just wage is on a relative basis, because there are too many variables, and that under the circumstances, the only way in which one can reasonably decide, for instance, whether a transit worker in New York is being overpaid or underpaid, this is where you don't have a market process, is by comparing the rate of people who quit that job over against the rate of people who quit comparable jobs. And on the basis of that index, the municipality ought to increase wages or maintain them at the current level.
May I comment on that? I said earlier, before Mr. Buckley and I began jousting, that I felt very strongly that wages for newspaper men or television broadcasters, particularly for those who are not professional, but even for those who are professional in many instances, that part of the democratic process is a necessity, not to have some mechanism decide, like Mussolini thought he had a mechanism for deciding, or Hitler or Stalin thought they had a mechanism for deciding, and I'm not using that demagogy.
Or Mahatma Gandhi.
Well, no, Mahatma Gandhi was yes, he was a socialist of sorts, but let me stay with my point, that in our kind of society, the adversarial relationship between labor and management is one of the real defenders of reasonableness and freedom in that society. And if we have some guy sitting in Yale or Harvard deciding who's right and wrong and charging $100 an hour to give his advice, that you deprive our society of freedom.
That's his mother's fault.
Yale, excuse me. But
she didn't know he was going to work at the University of Chicago.
Mr. Buckley,
he's never been to Yale or Harvard.
I apologize for the mistake I made. The important thing is that these things cannot be decided mechanically in our kind of society, that these are the kinds of things that should be decided and that test the freedom of that society. And that society is like ours, like the political process. You can't just give an IQ test and decide who should be president of the United States. You can't have a formula who's the best governor for the state of Maryland. If you had such a formula, Marvin Mandel would not be governor. You know, the point is, in our society, we let the people decide. We let various free forces in our society decide what's equitable and what's not. And that sometimes hurts and that sometimes helps. Well, we just think we need a mechanism for seeing to it that we have access to the system, and that mechanism does not exist for public workers in the United States. It does in most other free societies, all other free societies.
Miss Martha Angle is with the Washington Star-News. Miss Angle?
Well, at the risk of usurping the rest of the program, I'd like to direct a question to each of you. And Bill, I'm a little confused by your response to Bob's question on your proposal for dealing with the just demands of public workers. You seem to be suggesting that if the public worker is not getting a fair shake from his current employer, he should simply go elsewhere. But this is a little difficult to do in a society where we are already in a severe unemployment situation and there aren't that many jobs. And if he's put in, 10 years on a job and has some built-up fringe benefits and other protections, why should he leave it and go off in search of another job?
Well, I'm glad that I can point to having raised that point ahead of you, which is that to the extent that you reward a worker by perks that decreases mobility, you freeze him or tend to freeze him in his job, but it is nevertheless true.
Is that to say that no worker should be entitled to health insurance or pension retirement?
No, it's just that we should recognize what are the consequences of policies we adopt, and that's one of them. Now, you might say, I don't give a damn that that's one of the policies. I nevertheless want to do it that way. Now, there are people, for instance, who wouldn't leave their job as a motorman in a New York subway tomorrow if you paid them nothing. if in fact 2 years from now they're going to get, as they are entitled to get after 20 years service, 50% of their wages for the rest of their lives. So under the circumstances, they are not very useful data in terms of an exploration of the kind raised by Mr. Kuttner.
But a motorman in New York who is not getting an adequate wage should go to another city and uproot his family in search of a more adequate wage?
Let me introduce you to America. It happens all the time. 20% of the American people change their jobs in the course of a given year. We have the most labor-mobile society in the history of the world. And that's exactly what happens. How in the hell do you account for the number of black people who came from the South to the North in the last 15 or 20 years, or, as a matter of fact, for the return in the opposite direction? How do you account for the number of people who went to California? The fact of the matter is that a tremendous number of people will go, and not merely, I'm not talking about just janitors, I'm talking about professors. I know a lot of professors who will take a job at the University of New Mexico tomorrow if they're given a job that's better than the one that they hold down now in the East or in Washington, D.C. So the answer is that this is how the overwhelming majority of the American people, in fact, are enticed out of one job into another.
If they are dissatisfied with their current job, rather than have a right to
That's right,
press
but there are a lot of
for it, they should
intangibles.
leave.
You're right, there are a lot of intangibles. They might be the sick mother here, or they might be the wife who simply says, I can't be happy in Santa Fe, or they may be a pollen count in Santa Fe that's disagreeable, or they may be a library here. He's a nut on the 12th century, and the library that has a 12th century collection is right here. So all of these imponderables, whether it's an academician or a janitor, do figure, but still you get meaningful data from the flow of labor.
Do you have time for one quick question for Mr. Moore? Or are we running? I don't want to.
Yeah.
You have very carefully used the phrase voluntary arbitration as your suggested solution to the problem of the lack of a right to strike. What's the matter with compulsory arbitration?
Compulsory arbitration, there's nothing the matter with it except one concern, that we deal with public officials who are notorious for their lack of candor or reasonableness and so on.
How'd you get there?
We unfortunately are not...
Democracy's fault?
No.
Did Mussolini have that many?
No, we have a situation this... Well, let me answer her and then I'll come back to you, sir. The fear I have is that instead of dealing with the situation short of by having voluntary arbitration there, we sort of impose upon the parties a need to settle the issues rather than sort of taking the position, well, I can get there anyway, you know, and this is an easy way out and I don't have to exercise leadership and so on. And therefore, I think it is much better, as we've learned from the Canadian experience, the European experiences, even some of the countries that fascinate Mr. Buckley. In those places, the right to strike is very seldom.
Hell fascinates me too. You know?
Yeah, well, right. In those places, the right to strike, reasonable collective bargaining mechanisms exist, arbitration mechanisms exist, as close as Canada. And in essence, if public officials in this country do not have the kind of managerial skill, public service in this country is very badly managed as compared to other societies, and the kind of people we have to deal with are frequently not very apt people, and they would like to occasionally, not always, be deprived of the burden of decision making or be deprived of the burden of taking responsibility, so therefore there's a tendency to evade it. Therefore, I would like to have voluntary situations.
Mr. Frank Donatelli of the Young Americans for Freedom. Mr. Donatelli?
Yes, Mr. Worf, I would like to ask you to amplify on your statement earlier that any institution should have reasonable limits placed on it. And I would like to ask you to comment on the labor unions in this country today. For example, the antitrust laws do not extend to labor unions. Labor unions have consistently fought for repeal of Section 14B of the Taft-Hartley Act, which allows states to ban the union shop. Labor unions are specifically exempt from many of the campaign laws that have been passed in the country requiring disclosure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the recent campaign reform bill specifically did not include labor union in-kind contributions.
Well, why don't you ask me some questions and
all right,
give me time for an
making a little background. My real question is, what's wrong in your opinion?
3 minutes.
What's wrong in your opinion with extending antitrust laws to unions?
Well, first of all, we're people. We're not commodities. And the
So
antitrust
corporate
laws,
executives.
I listened to you with one interruption, now we're even. The antitrust laws were applied at a time to destroy the viability of unions to deal fairly with an employer. The Danbury Hatters case, which I'm sure even members of the YAF are familiar with, sort of illustrated what a power structure that exists in the United States could do to labor unions under the antitrust laws. Nobody who wants to give a worker the right to sit at a bargaining table as an equal wants to apply the antitrust laws. I'm quickly moving on with some of those questions. With regard to campaign, the Corrupt Practices Act applies to unions and corporations at the same time. The one labor union leader I know who was convicted of violating the Corrupt Practices Act by giving money to a candidate got 5 years in jail. He was not a very nice fellow in any event, but he got 5 years in jail.
He wasn't the guy who killed the other guy,
but he got 5 years in jail long before he'd been convicted of killing anybody. But when the president of United Airlines was convicted of exactly the same misuse of funds under the very same statute, he got a $1,000 fine, and the president of a half a dozen other corporations, banks and whatnot, got slapped on their wrist. We're under the same Corrupt Practices Act. In the campaign reform laws, no union can use Treasury funds, dues collection funds, in federal elections. In those elections, the money has to be collected from the worker specifically for the purpose for which it's used. And this whole hula that unions have a vast amount of political clout in this country is absurd. 3 out of 4
George
working...
Meany says it's not absurd. He says he has tremendous clout.
Well, that's his problem. When you get George
You mean
Meany
he's
on your
wrong?
program, you argue with him.
What about
But
in-kind
3 out of 4
contributions?
Americans...
How about in-kind contributions?
Please let me talk for a moment.
30 seconds.
3 out of 4 Americans are not members of the American labor movement. I suggest to you that it's because of that we in the United States give less to the poor, to the hungry. That's why we have 6.5 million unemployed, and there's 100 unemployed in Switzerland who are citizens of the nation. I suggest to you that this conservative concept that if you destroy the labor unions, you'll have a great America. I suggest to you that you'll have an America that's incapable of making any progress, that you'll have an America whose freedoms will become rather shaky.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank
Wirth.
you, Mr. Buckley.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the panel. Thank you all.
For a printed, bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Production funding provided by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.